In 123 BC, a Roman politician named Gaius Gracchus stood before the Roman people and offered them something no Roman government had offered before. Subsidized grain, not free, not charity, but grain sold below market price to eligible Roman citizens through a formal state distribution system. The crowd loved it, the Senate was furious, and something began that day that has never fully stopped. What began as subsidized grain became free grain within 60 years. What became free grain became an institutional system, feeding 200,000 registered Roman citizens every month. What became a monthly distribution became one of the most sophisticated political machines in ancient history, a mechanism that transformed the act of feeding people into an instrument of political loyalty, social dependence, and imperial control so powerful that Rome's rulers maintained and expanded it for centuries regardless of the financial cost. And what Rome built, the logic, the mechanisms, the political incentives, did not disappear when the Western Roman Empire fell. It became the template, not copied deliberately, not hidden in a conspiracy, but studied, understood, and reproduced by every political system that faced the same fundamental challenge Rome faced. How do you maintain the loyalty of a large urban population that has the numbers to destabilize everything if it becomes desperate enough? The answer Rome discovered, and that every subsequent government has rediscovered in its own language and its own institutions, is the same answer. You make yourself indispensable to the people whose loyalty you need, you control what they depend on, and you make sure they know it was you who delivered it. By the time this video ends, you will understand not just what Rome's grain system was, but why it was built the way it was, who it served, who it excluded, and why the political mechanism at its center, public resources converted into political loyalty, is not ancient history. It is the operating logic of modern democratic politics in ways that most political analysis carefully avoids naming directly. Let us start with a correction, because if you have ever heard the phrase bread and circuses, you have almost certainly heard it misused. The phrase comes from the Roman poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century AD. In his Satire 10, he wrote that the Roman people who once commanded armies and governed republics now wanted only two things: bread and circuses, food and public entertainment. Most modern uses of this phrase treat it as a government strategy, a deliberate plan by Roman leaders to distract and pacify the population. And while that political calculation was absolutely real, that is not what Juvenal was saying. Juvenal was not criticizing the government. He was criticizing the people. He was saying the Roman citizenry had voluntarily surrendered their political responsibility in exchange for short-term comfort. They had traded the power to govern for the pleasure of being governed. That distinction matters because it makes the modern comparison far sharper, because Juvenal's accusation contains two separate charges. The first charge is against leaders who use material benefits and entertainment to manage citizens. The second charge is against citizens who accept that management and call it care. Both charges apply in Rome, and both charges are worth examining in the world you live in today. Now let us understand exactly what the Roman grain system actually was, because it was not a simple handout. It was an extraordinary logistics operation that connected the political stability of the world's largest city to a supply chain stretching across the entire Mediterranean. Grain came to Rome from Egypt, from North Africa, from Sicily, from Sardinia, from dozens of provincial territories. It crossed the Mediterranean on ships. It was stored in enormous warehouses. It was processed and distributed through a bureaucratic system that tracked registered recipients, managed seasonal shortages, and maintained the continuous flow of food into a city of over 1 million people. The government had to tax or purchase the grain, protect the shipping routes, manage the storage, prevent spoilage, handle distribution logistics, and maintain the entire supply chain year-round without interruption. And here is the political reality that most discussions of Roman grain policy miss entirely. Whoever controlled that supply chain controlled the stability of the capital, not the army, not the treasury, the grain, because an army could defend Rome against an external enemy, but nothing could defend Rome's rulers against 1 million hungry urban citizens except a continuous supply of food. This is why Roman emperors did not merely organize the grain supply. They branded themselves with it. An emperor did not announce that the state had imported grain from Egypt. The message, delivered through public ceremony, coin imagery, and political theater, was this: the emperor feeds Rome, not the logistics system, not the provincial farmers who grew it, not the sailors who shipped it, the emperor. Personally, the political genius of the Roman grain system was not in the grain. It was in the claim of personal generosity that the grain allowed its ruler to make. But now we need to talk about who actually received the grain, because the distribution system was not universal, and its exclusions reveal the political design underneath the social policy. The grain dole was connected to Roman citizenship, registration, and residence in the capital. Women were largely excluded from the direct distribution. Slaves were not entitled to the public grain. Non-citizens and most rural populations across the empire did not receive it. And crucially, the poor farmer in a distant province who was actually taxed to pay for the grain supply might receive none of the benefit that his taxation funded. The system focused its benefits on the urban citizen population of the capital, specifically on the group most capable of causing immediate political instability, the large, concentrated, politically aware urban poor of Rome itself. The grain dole did not create a universal welfare system. It created a politically important class of registered beneficiaries whose food security was tied to the continued functioning of the state and whose political loyalty was therefore manageable. This is one of the most important structural features of the Roman grain system that has modern parallels worth examining honestly. The state was not only feeding people, it was deciding who counted as a politically valuable person. Registration gave people food access, but registration also gave the state a list. A list of people whose dependence was now formally documented and whose political behavior could be influenced through that dependence. Now let us talk about what was happening simultaneously in Roman electoral politics, because the grain dole was only one dimension of how Roman politicians converted public and private resources into political loyalty. The other dimension was a practice so pervasive it had its own name: Ambitus. Ambitus originally meant simply going around canvassing for votes, but it came to describe the entire system of improper electoral influence through gifts, favors, meals, entertainment, legal assistance, debt arrangements, patronage networks, and payments to political intermediaries. Roman elections in the late Republic became extraordinarily expensive. Candidates spent personal fortunes on public banquets, gifts to supporters, entertainment, legal campaigns on behalf of allies, and the maintenance of elaborate client networks whose political loyalty was purchased and sustained through ongoing material benefit. And here is the detail about Roman electoral politics that most histories of corruption miss. The most effective political payment was rarely a direct exchange of cash for a vote. It was a relationship. A wealthy Roman candidate might provide meals, legal help, business introductions, personal protection, loans, employment for a voter's family members. The voter might never be explicitly told vote for me in exchange for this favor. The obligation existed through the patron-client relationship. Through a network of ongoing mutual benefit and deference that made political loyalty feel like natural gratitude rather than purchased compliance. The secret ballot introduced in the 2nd century BC made this more complicated. When candidates could no longer monitor how their clients voted, they had to increase the value of the favor given before the vote rather than relying on the ability to punish those who voted wrong. The secret ballot made Roman voters freer. And it made Roman politicians more generous before election day. When you cannot inspect the vote, you increase the investment in the relationship. Rome passed repeated laws against Ambitus trying to regulate the boundary between illegal bribery and accepted elite generosity. But that boundary was always unclear. A direct cash payment might be illegal. A lavish public feast given by a candidate to the people of his district might be traditional. A government welfare announcement timed for the period just before a major vote might be entirely legal. The question was never simply was money transferred. The question was whether public policy was designed primarily for public welfare or for political survival. And that question, the one Rome never fully answered and that every modern democracy struggles with, is the one this video has been building toward, because modern governments do not distribute grain, but they do distribute subsidies, transfers, public services, tax credits, fuel support, housing assistance, healthcare, education. And the political mechanisms through which those distributions are designed, timed, targeted, and presented to voters bear a remarkable structural resemblance to the political mechanisms Rome developed around bread and circuses 2,000 years ago. The Roman grain dole protected genuine human need. It prevented famine. It stabilized prices. It reduced the threat of food riots that could destabilize the capital. Modern welfare programs do the same. They prevent malnutrition. They support families during economic hardship. They correct market failures. They reduce inequality in ways that produce genuine human benefit, and both systems can simultaneously serve another purpose. A government that controls what people depend on has leverage, not necessarily sinister leverage. Not necessarily corrupt leverage, but leverage nonetheless. Because a citizen who depends on a government program for food or fuel or housing or healthcare is a citizen whose relationship to that government is not purely a matter of political evaluation. It is also a matter of personal survival. Rome extracted grain from distant provinces, taxed from farmers who did not receive it, and redistributed it to the politically valuable urban population of the capital. Modern national governments extract tax from rural and provincial populations, and concentrate spending in dense urban centers where votes are concentrated and political instability would be most visible and damaging. The geographic logic is identical even when the specific mechanisms are different. The Roman emperor who ensured grain shipments presented himself as the personal protector of Rome's citizens. Modern political leaders put their names on relief checks, announce welfare expansions at campaign rallies, time subsidy increases to election cycles, and present themselves as the personal authors of benefits that are in fact administered by bureaucratic systems that existed before they arrived and will continue after they leave. The political theater is structurally identical even when the scale and the context are different. Juvenal saw all of this clearly in the 2nd century AD. He saw citizens who had surrendered political engagement for material comfort, who had traded the power to hold their rulers accountable for the security of knowing the grain would arrive, who had become, in his damning phrase, a population interested only in bread and circuses. The Roman lesson is not that bread is bad. The lesson is not that every government benefit is a bribe. The lesson is more precise and more uncomfortable than either of those simple readings. The danger begins not when a government feeds the poor. The danger begins when citizens are treated as clients instead of rights-bearing members of a republic. When public resources become personal gifts attributed to the ruler's generosity rather than entitlements belonging to every citizen. When the government asks for loyalty in exchange for necessities. When citizens find that rejecting the government means losing access to what the government controls. Rome built the first institutionalized version of that arrangement. The grain came from the provinces. The political loyalty stayed in Rome. The emperor's name was on the distribution, and for centuries it worked. The vault has been open since Gaius Gracchus stood before the Roman people in 123 BC and offered them subsidized grain. The question is not whether governments should help their people. The question is whether you are receiving a right or being trained to depend on the person who controls the supply.